So, um, we kind of talked a lot about requirements at a really high level, but one thing that we didn't cover much on, which kind of falls into that specification or even an analysis specification part of requirements engineering, is how to represent a system or how to represent a requirement a little bit. And this is why we're going to delve into both use cases and user stories. And they're two very different things. Firstly, what motivates this is the fact that while it's all cool that in the last lecture I showed you these like fancy schmancy legalistic documents that specify all these rules that make you want to fall asleep, right? In reality, requirements are often very human. You know, if you're kind of building something not because you have to follow a law, but because you're trying to build the right thing for people, people are human and you want to be able to capture that and you want to be able to express the complexity of people as well. So we're going to look at user stories as a topic and use cases as a topic as well. So the first one is user stories. These things are massive in the kind of the world of Agile. Agile kind of appeared out of the ground. We talked about Agile way back earlier in the course. I think back in week 2, maybe 3. Can't remember. I think it might have been week 3. No, week 2. Thought so. User stories, funny term. It's simply a method of requirements engineering used to inform the development process and what features to build with the user at the center. It's literally just a way of writing requirements that puts the user at the center of that process. And all it is you just trying to write a requirement with a particular structure. And that structure is as simple as when a customer tells you what you want, you try and represent that in some form by saying, as a insert type of user, I want to insert something you're trying to achieve, so that insert give the background of why you're trying to achieve it. So if a student comes up to you and says, hey, I really like to be able to purchase monthly parking tickets online. Maybe that's something that happens from the elicitation process of requirements. You might write a user story that is, as a student, I want to purchase a parking pass so that I can drive to school. Right? And this is really important because you want to tell someone who the person is that you're trying to satisfy. You want to tell them what they're trying to do. And then you want to tell them why they're trying to do it. And that why is really important and critical, because these user stories are like given to developers, just like you've seen how I have this here. And it's important if you just say something to someone like, I want to see my current progress towards my goal, and you don't emphasize that more human element, that it's about being reminded and motivated, some of the power of that requirement might be lost in translation. This is also a really great time to be conscious of the XY problem, because when someone says to you, I want to purchase monthly parking passes online, it's always a good idea to stop them and be like, but why? You know, and sometimes it appears like this where they say, oh, I just want to drive to school. And you go, okay, well, that's fair enough. Sometimes it might be worth, digging deeper and saying, why do you want to drive to school? And they say public transport's too slow, you know? So there's no like right level of granularity for a user story, right? There's no way to be like, that's too detailed, that's not detailed enough. But it's just always worth exploring to try and get the right answer. Generally, good user stories are non-technical. They don't look like this scary thing here. They're focused on the customer and the customer's experience. They're user-focused, not product feature focused. So as much as possible, you try not to write them as if you want to have a particular feature in a product. That's where things can get really tricky. I've kind of, this one's a very hard line to flirt with, because often what people want is a feature. They often want a thing to do a thing. So sometimes your user stories will always end up being a little bit featurey. You just need to limit that as much as possible. So always challenge yourself to make it more about a problem, like, oh, I want to be able to feel motivated towards a goal, rather than be like, I want to have a pie chart that tells me my progress visually. Like that's the difference between something that's maybe a bit higher level and something that's a bit more specific. And therefore, user stories should generally describe problems and not solutions. And the other properties of user stories, we want them to be independent. As in, you can kind of work on, you can kind of solve one but not the other. They shouldn't be like too interdependent where to solve one, you have to solve the other. They should be negotiable, as in, they shouldn't have too much detail. If your user stories have too much detail, then what starts to happen is that you limit developers and designers' ability to kind of be creative, right? If your user story is too specific, like it's like you need a pie chart with progress, then suddenly the person who's implementing that later on in the life cycle, they have to do what you've told them. Whereas if you be a bit more vague, that you just want to show progress, you give more like creative control to people later on. They should be valuable, obviously. They should hold some value to the kind of client or customer. They should be estimable. This says we'll get to it in a later lecture. We've cut that out so to save you one more thing to talk about. But basically, it's like it should be clear how hard it is. It shouldn't be super vague, like so vague that someone's just like, I have no idea. This could be really big. This could be really small. You do want it to be small-ish. Basically, you want to be able to break things up, ideally, into smaller pieces, and it should be testable. Every user story should have a way to actually test it. For someone to sit down and be like, did we meet this user story so that, can I prove that someone can now do this thing that they could not otherwise do before? Right? All of these things are important. There's some reading from some Atlassian articles, but like, for instance, if we take a quick pause and we say, let's try and write out some user stories for like a to-do list, right? Well, that could be fun. In the chat, someone tell me, what would you, if you were trying to, let's imagine I'm trying to elicit some requirements from you. Tell me what you want out of a to-do list app. I'm asking you, like, tell me the things you want to do, and I'll start trying to write them down as user stories as we go. So just send it in the chat and we'll write it up quickly. Don't make me pause the video. You take a long time. Priority? Okay, so someone says priority. Matthew says priority. So maybe I'll say as a student, let's say, or as a young person, whatever. It's a bit weird. As a student, I want to be able to prioritize, and I'm making some assumptions here that I should probably go back to Matthew with and ask. I want to be able to prioritize my to-do list items so that I can easily see what is most important to me. Okay, that's an example of, Matthew says, I really want to be able to prioritize my to-do list. So now I've gone and written it in that user story format that you see up here on the screen. It's a pretty sleepy lecture tonight, so I'm going to assume that we don't have any more than that. But that's just an example of how you can write a user story. On the topic of user stories, I'll just move on. Maybe someone else will share one later. Riz says tag tasks with categories. Okay. As a student, I want to be able to tag tasks with categories so that I can easily see groups of interrelated tasks. Maybe that could be a bit better elaborated on, or, so that I don't feel overwhelmed by a giant pile of uncategorized tasks. It could be anything, and this is where you go talk to Riz and you go learn to understand it. This makes it human. That's a really important part. That why is a very, very real and human aspect to it. When you write user stories, another thing you'll often write alongside it is user acceptance criteria. User acceptance criteria is essentially a method to help test whether a user story has been satisfied. It allows us to kind of break down a user story into criteria that must be met to achieve it. And it's generally written very kind of casually, naturally, and we try and do it before we implement things. It's really just like a way of, think of it like writing jest tests, except that user stories are really high level, so is user acceptance criteria. And we kind of tie this off in the very last lecture we have today. But it's not often jest tests. It's actually written like a checklist that a human might go and check. So let's imagine that we have, for instance, a user story that's like, as a user, I want to use a search field to type a city, name, or street so that I can find matching hotel options. So maybe you're building a hotel website looking for hotels to book. You might write down some user acceptance criteria that you agree on with the stakeholders. So this can be part of the process you go through with people like your actual users and customers, which might be like, well, here's some checkboxes. The search field's placed on the top bar. The search starts once the user clicks search. The field contains a placeholder with gray colored text. The placeholder disappears once the user starts typing. Searches before, so forth. These are actually really specific user acceptance criteria. They're kind of here to demonstrate a bit of a dramatic point. In reality, I'd probably say that these user acceptance criteria might be a tiny bit too detailed for your typical application. But again, whether they're really high level or detailed, it would depend on what your particular group of people is trying to achieve at a particular time. And that's okay. Another example of user acceptance criteria might be like if I have a requirement that is, as a user, I want to be able to log in through a social media account, and I want to do that because I always forget my passwords, right? That's why I love signing in with Google. So the user acceptance criteria might just be can log in with Facebook, can log in with LinkedIn, can log in with Twitter, can log in with Apple, can log in with Google. That could be the user acceptance criteria. And the way these criteria are taken is quite literally people go and test the system later on, and they just like check this off, and they'd be like, yep, it's all working fine. So some other points on user acceptance criteria: they shouldn't be too broad, and they also shouldn't be too narrow, just like user stories. They should minimize technical detail, just like user stories. If they're too technical, then it becomes hard for like clients to understand them. Basically, they need to be understood by someone who's not a software engineer, is the short story. And while they can be updated during development, because you always learn things when you're developing, we generally want to get them right at the very start. You perform acceptance tests to make sure that the user acceptance criteria is met. I mean, again, you get this. Imagine that you're cleaning your room and you're restructuring your room, and I write you a bunch of tests that's like, the bed should be near the window, the door should be able to open fully. You could give that to someone who could come in and look at they could look at what the person who reorganized your room ended up doing based on your requirements and your user stories, so to speak, and they could check them off. And they're also black box in nature because they're really, really high level. Sometimes in the software world, I just gave you this example about rearranging a room, but in the software world, what we'll often do is we will often go and create what we call user acceptance testing or UAT environments, which is where we might create an entire copy of a piece of software that we give to people, so every time we like make a change, we kind of give it to the people who are using our software, and we're like, can you check these things off and tell us if you think that it satisfied everything for you? So it's kind of, it's very interesting, very fun. Sometimes we can write our user acceptance tests in a bit more of a free-flowing manner. If you find the general structure of it a little bit overwhelming, you can always write it out like this, where you go like through a scenario given, when, and then given dot point structure. So you're like, if you think about the forget password, I want to be able to recover the password to my account so that I'll be able to access it in case I forgot it. Well, you're like, well, in a scenario where I forgot my password, and given that the user has navigated to the login page, when they select the forgot password option and they enter a valid email, I want the system to send them a link to the entered email. And given that the user entered that link, when the user navigates to that link in their email, I want the system to be able to help them set a new password. Now, again, this one is quite detailed to really accentuate the point, but the gist here is that if you find that kind of free flow structure, you can go and write user acceptance criteria in a bit more of this kind of like given, when, then. Sometimes I think it's called like given, when, then typically. The ends and the scenarios and stuff are all just kind of added for fluff, but it's often like, given this assumption, when this occurs, then this should happen. That's the underlying reality of it. Which one should you use? Either's fine. Both work totally fine. Then the last part of this lecture is talking about use cases or use case diagrams. So we said at the start that we'll be talking about user stories today, and we'll be talking about use cases. Use cases aren't strictly like user stories. We're saying let's write requirements in a friendly way. Use cases are more like, let's describe how a system should work in a visual way. And what use case diagrams often do is they represent a dialogue, or I shouldn't say diagrams because we're going to look at some non-diagrams, but they represent a dialogue between the user and the system. And the purpose of writing up use cases is to more easily communicate how a particular user or customer interacts with, a software system or a business. And it's all based on the idea of like, a conversation where a user does this and the system responds with that, and a user does this and the system responds with that. And again, they're all very high level and they are all very black boxy. The two ways we're going to look at today are we're going to look at use case diagrams that are a list of steps, basically steps written down, or when they are diagrams, something visual. And diagrams are going to speak to people a little bit more. So, this is an example of a written down version where what we might do is we might give some background or some context to the use case where we say, you know what, here's a particular use case. This is what the user is trying to achieve in this use case. This is what occurs before the use case exists, and like blah, blah, blah. There's like a lot of stuff here. Yeah. This is kind of useful in both the written case and the diagram case. It's really just providing background. This is a little bit over the top though. We don't expect this much detail. This is just kind of here for completeness. But an example of a use case diagram might be this one here, where we're trying to describe the interaction that a customer has with an ATM as they go and try and withdraw money. So say a customer comes up to an ATM and the machine says to them, enter your PIN, and then the customer enters a PIN. And then the machine goes and talks to the bank and it says, hey, bank, can I verify this account? And the bank responds, yes, you can. They look valid. Here's their balance. And then the machine comes back to the user and says, hey, all good. How can I help? The user says, can I withdraw $60? The machine says, hey, all right, here you go. Here's your money. And then the machine goes to the bank and says, hey, that person that you told me is valid. They withdrew this money. And the bank says, great, thank you. So this is really interesting because without this kind of visual element, if you were to try and write this down, I mean, if you just ignore for a second, that it can be very uninclusive for people with, things like dyslexia, this just makes it instantly understandable what's going on. You're like, oh, okay, cool. I see. Someone's just trying to withdraw money from the bank, and I get a sense of how the flow works here. You could write it down as a list, though, in a more, textual form by saying, well, there's just 8 steps. The ATM asks the customer for a PIN, the customer enters it, the ATM asks the bank. It's exactly what I described before, but it is just a little bit colder, a little bit more sterile, I guess you'd say, which is okay. Sometimes this is easier, obviously, because you don't need to draw anything. But it can also be a bit harder to like really quickly understand. And you know what it's like when you're tired. You try and read stuff and your brain just melts. So they're just kind of different ways of approaching it. There's a whole bunch more reading you can read about on like use cases and user stories. But before we finish up this lecture and then smash through our last one, which only takes 5 minutes, and then we just did this week's done pretty quick. I want to take a quick 5-minute pause with you and say, there's this article I loved. It's from my first year. It was on, oh no. Damn it. They got rid of it. That's a shame. Anyway, I should have saved it. There was a funny April Fool's article where they were like, UNSW is going to build a monorail from the bottom of campus to the top of campus. And I love this question because it's like, let's pretend or let's have some fun for a minute as if like they were actually going to build the monorail. So let's imagine that UNSW was actually going to build a monorail for a second. And I came to you again, just like we did before. And I said, tell me, as a student, what you'd want from the monorail. Now, again, you think about requirements engineering and other kind of elicitation. It's not just students we're interested in. It's also stakeholders like, UNSW management and the people who are constructing the uni and so forth and so forth. And you might come up and say, let's try and write some, we won't do any use cases, but let's at least try and write some user stories. Well, maybe not everything works with a user story, right? but let's try it out. As a student, let's imagine I've talked to a student, and these are some things I might have heard from students. As a student, I want to be able to monorail between stops. Let's imagine there's just 2 stops. Actually, that should be a requirement. There shall be 2 stops, one on lower campus, lower than the law library, and one on upper campus, higher than Scientia. You know, so maybe that's like a requirement that's not, and that's a non. You could kind of break this up. Typically, usually it's a good idea to break requirements up. So like this one, there shall be 2 stops, or at least 2 stops, say. And this one is a functional requirement because it's telling you what it does, and this one's a non-functional requirement because it's like constraining it in some way. So then we have a user story down here. As a student, I want to be able to monorail between stops in less than 5 minutes, because if it takes longer, I might as well walk. As a student, I don't want to pay for the monorail because walking is easy and free, or monorail directly, you know? So my point is that, and if anyone has any ideas, feel free to share, but this is kind of how, like, if you were tasked with a very big, broad problem, like trying to get a monorail working for a uni, you could talk to people like the university management, to students, to alumni, to the general public, and you could start to build this picture with user stories. You could maybe then, you know, draw some use case diagrams later on where you show what it's like to actually get on the light rail, where maybe, you know, you tap your student card and then you hop on the light rail and then it moves and then you get off it and then you tap it again, or however else. Bill says the monorail have to take students from K17 to Boost in 3 minutes. There you go. And if you got enough people suggesting that, maybe you could turn it into part of the requirements. Maybe you have that as a requirement, but when you go and validate it with the university before they give you the money to do it, they come back and they say that's not going to happen. You know, it's a very human process, all of this, to try and get it right. Yeah. So yes, that's all I have to say, really. Cool. Okay. Yeah, again, that's just to lightly touch on the example. Just to recap, we have covered user stories and use case diagrams. If you do have more to add, if you do have feedback to add, I'd love for you to fill that in. Again, it's always appreciated. Same as every lecture. Thank you.